Hello, I'm Michael Peake, and for the last 42 years I've been a Toronto Sun photographer, known as Sun 4 back when we used two-way radios. I thought I'd take this few minutes, now that I have retired, to look back on that career and those 42 years of taking photos and how the city has changed so much, and it certainly has. But many things are the same, but a lot of things are different. The police cars have definitely changed color. These are the bookends of my career. My first and last front pages, both opposition leaders, Robert Nixon on the left, Patrick Brown on the right, taken 42 years apart, so some things do stay the same. This was our photo crew back in 1975, Barry Gray, Dave Cooper, Hugh Wesley, Norm Betts, me in the back, all still alive and clicking. And in typical Sun fashion, they produced a very cheeky ad for their team of photographers back then. It was a lot of fun. I was just out of journalism school at Ryerson, 23 years old, and proud to be a part of a busy and growing industry and city. Times were booming. I found out the job requires a lot of waiting and a lot of trudging through snow to get to places, but it also is meeting people, and that's a big part of it. Like famed photographer Josef Karsh, who called us for some help one day when he was shooting downtown. We all raced over to meet the master, and I even got to take his picture, which was a thrill. He said I had the face of a nymph, and I'd have to say he has the face of a photographer. Prime Minister Trudeau, Pierre that is, would come into town from time to time in the 70s. He was very popular. Remember his last visit threatened to throw this shovelful of dirt on protesters at Nathan Phillips Square. So it was always fun being around him, and there was always something happening. It was kind of interesting that my career began and ended with a Prime Minister Trudeau in power. In 1982, I had an amazing assignment, and I accompanied Toronto Sun editor Peter Worthington to Mount Gongga in Tibet for 7 weeks with a group of BC climbers. We were sponsors and covering their attempt to scale this very difficult Himalayan peak. They didn't do it because the weather was too bad. It snowed almost every day, but what an amazing experience to be in the Himalayas and at altitude here at almost 18,000 feet, which is very tough, but see a part of the world I never expected to see. And a memorable photo for me was on my 30th birthday, posing with Peter at the Simila Pass, looking back on the mountain. This is the front page when we got back in the city, and when we shot this in camp, Peter, not to be outdone, decided to pick me up in his arms. The first person to do so since my mother. 70s was a very different time, a lot fewer regulations. This guy used to walk around with a cougar on a leash. My first Santa Claus parade aftermath shot, monster traffic jam. I always liked this picture. And little human interest features like this little kid, Puddin' Smith, who was sticking up for his sister and got into a fight, and just a nice portrait. This shot caused a lot of commotion with this bait shop owner enjoying a plate of worms. It was a pretty tumultuous time, a lot of spot news, accidents and fires, a lot of fires, very different than today. Firefighters back then were much more gonzo types who'd race into buildings without even air packs on and make incredible rescues, and fire regulations have slowed all those fires down, fortunately. The Big Eaton's fire in '76 was huge, and this Mississauga heating oil fire was pretty memorable as well. The pop music group Bay City Rollers couldn't get out of their car when they arrived at Chum Radio in the late 70s. The girls were all swooning and going crazy. Freddie Mercury with Queen at Maple Leaf Gardens in 1978, and I even got to photograph Keith Richards while he was still young. One person we photographed a lot was the irascible and kind of crazy Harold Ballard, owned the Maple Leafs. He latterly owned the Hamilton Tiger Cats, which meant, of course, he'd have to hate the Argos. And we liked Harold because he'd do anything he wanted and do it repeatedly. The murder of shoeshine boy Emmanuel Jacks in the 70s was a huge event. I got an exclusive shot of the killers on their way to jail after the murder conviction, and I think the headline's right. I believe he's still in prison. They weren't too happy with me, and I like to think this was the last laugh they had. We always did a lot of car pictures. We had a regular automotive writer, and one day Dan Proudfoot wanted me to photograph a Pinto, so I grabbed the keys from him and took the car down, got my lunch, and drove right down to the waterfront, which you could do easily in those days. Took a picture of the car and had my lunch, and while I was sitting there with the engine off, the car started to smoke all by itself. And within a few minutes, it was fully engulfed in flame. I had called the office to call the fire department on the two-way radio, and they came and they saw me photographing this burning car and thought I had set it afire and was taking pictures of it. However, I was an innocent victim. It was quite a scene. Ford Motor Company wasn't too happy. I did live up to the promise to Dan. I brought back his keys and his melted wallet. We used to shoot a lot of school sports back then, high school and even public school. This poor player breaking his leg one day at York Memorial, and this group of grade 8s winning the city baseball championship. We don't do that much anymore, but it was a lot of fun. Of course, the first Blue Jays game, Doug Ault hitting the first Blue Jays home run. Talk about a different era. Right after that, we took Blue Jays slugger Otto Velez out, Jane O'Hara and I, to try and find them an apartment to live that they could afford. Very different era. Sports, as always, hockey, number one really in this town, back when there were no ads on the boards even. And you can't imagine this happening today. Maple Leafs captain Darryl Sittler being hoisted by fans on their shoulders in Pearson Airport back when the Leafs flew commercial and they arrived back from their 1978 win over the New York Islanders. Closing of the Gardens, where so many things had happened, and the closest I got to a Stanley Cup was my son Tom on the front page. But I did get to photograph the first goal at the ACC by Austin Matthews, and I do regret not being able to see what will be his amazing career through my lens, so I'll just have to enjoy it on television. In 1980, the murder of police officer Michael Sweet was a huge event, trapped in a club downtown, and the cops couldn't get to him. I got exclusive pictures of one of the killers arriving at the hospital. It was a very chaotic scene, and also covered the funeral where one of his buddies was overcome. A pretty cool assignment was going down with TV legend Milton Berle in the mid-90s to Havana and getting to know him a bit, and boy, he was a different kind of guy from the old era. Politicians, of course, were a big part of our job. Mel Lastman loved a camera. And the Rob Ford era could really never be duplicated. It was a pretty wild time. The two of them together was quite amazing. And I even got to photograph Donald Trump on his way to becoming president of the United States. Of course, Sunshine Girls are kind of what we're famous for. And even back when we used to do the Argo Sunshine Girls back in the 70s. And yes, some of them were very memorable. Even the last one I shot, 18-year-old Skylar, just a couple of weeks ago. So beautiful. What I really liked to do in my spare time was to head north and visit my mosquito friends. Our group, the Hideaway Canoe Club, did many thousands of miles of far northern historically based canoe routes. We shared these trips with our Sun readers, first through spreads after the trips were over, and later electronically when we would take them along with us and move pictures and stories every day, kind of a busman's holiday. We had to take along a lot of extra gear. Our first trip in 97, the online trip, that record player looking device is actually a 40-pound sat phone. So the equipment got smaller, it got a little easier, as you can see here, but it was very cool to connect with people while we were in the far north, and they could read about what we were seeing, polar bears and rapids and really remote areas of Canada. And my three brothers and I were very grateful for the incredible experience we had canoeing there. But I guess the picture I'm most famous for is my national newspaper award-winning shot of Krista Daniel, a model, getting jumped by this tiger in what was just supposed to be a silly little weather shot. And the tiger very quickly turned and jumped her, but not trying to kill her, just wrestling with her like a big dog would. Of course, she didn't know that, but she was fine. The tiger was declawed, and I got a pretty fine picture out of the deal. So like a good canoeist, I will paddle off into the sunset. And whatever happens in the retirement years ahead, it's never going to match the 42 years I had as a Toronto Sun photographer. For the final time, for the Toronto Sun, I'm Michael Peake.